I should have known the moment I turned off the highway and saw the old Warren house sitting under a thin layer of frost. It looked the same as it always had every December. The cedar wreath on the porch, the pale light strung unevenly across the gutter, the driveway that curved just enough to make parking a small battle. Nothing had changed on the outside, but something in me tightened as I pulled in. I had convinced myself I would walk through that front door and feel what people usually feel when they go home for Christmas. But instead I felt a quiet warning settle just under my ribs. I parked beside my father's aging blue pickup and stepped out into the cold. Tacoma winters had a way of working into your bones quick, and for a moment I stayed still and let the air bite at my cheeks. My parents were in the living room. I could see their shapes moving behind the curtain. They probably heard my car, but no one rushed out to greet me. That part I was used to. Inside the house, the warmth hit me fast along with the familiar scent of pine and whatever casserole my mother had put in the oven. She looked up from the kitchen table when I stepped in. She smiled, called my name, said it was good to have me home. It was the kind of greeting that never fully matched the emotion behind it. But I nodded and pretended not to notice. My father came around the corner, wiping his hands on a towel. He looked tired, even though the season was supposed to be a time for resting. He asked how the drive from Seattle had been, and I told him it was fine. Easy, quiet. He nodded as if that was all he needed to hear. Then Lauren appeared at the top of the stairs. She moved the way she always had, gracefully and with just enough flair to command attention without trying. Her hair was loose over her shoulder, and she wore a winter sweater that matched the decor like she had planned the entire house around herself. She hurried down to give me a quick hug, warm but fleeting, then stepped back with a brightness I had seen my entire life. She told me she had been waiting for me, that she had something to show me later. I told her I was curious, but my stomach tightened at her excitement. When Lauren was extra cheerful, it usually meant something had happened that I did not know about yet. The afternoon unfolded the usual way. My father adjusted the lights outside, muttering about bulbs that never stayed lit. My mother fussed in the kitchen, asking for help but never quite accepting it when offered. Lauren drifted from room to room, humming at times, checking her phone at others, making sure every mirror captured her at the right angle. I slipped into the background the way I had learned to since childhood, helping with small tasks, clearing what needed clearing, keeping the rhythm smooth. When evening came, the four of us finally gathered in the living room for the small family gift exchange. The tree glowed in that soft, uneven way it always had, and my father looked strangely proud as he settled into his chair. My mother urged us to hurry because dinner was nearly done. Lauren bounced onto the couch, ready before anyone even picked up a single box. My father started the ritual with a speech he never warned us about. He said this year had been full of changes and responsibilities and unexpected turns. He said families had to trust each other more than ever. I watched him carefully. His voice carried something weightier than simple sentiment, and my mother stood a little straighter behind him. Then he reached into the side table and lifted a small velvet pouch. He cleared his throat and said that he and my mother had decided it was time to pass along a very important duty. A responsibility, he said, meant for the person who needed support, who needed guidance, who needed to grow into it. Before I could make sense of his words, he turned to Lauren. He placed the velvet pouch in her hands. She clasped it as if it were jewelry. When she loosened the strings and tipped the contents into her palm, a small brass key slipped out. Not just any key. The key to the family safe. The only one. Lauren let out a soft breath of surprise. My mother clapped her hands together. My father looked proud. They all watched Lauren. No one looked at me. The safe was not a fortune by any means. It held the emergency funds my parents used when tax season came around, along with a small amount saved for house repairs. I had helped them rebuild that fund after a rough year in 2018. I had still been in my 20s then. I had thought I was doing the right thing. Now Lauren held the key. Lauren, who had never once cared about interest rates or deadlines or paying down anything she owed. Lauren, who lived by chance and charm. Lauren, who stared at the key like she deserved it. My father said something about trusting her to help with family business from now on. My mother said Lauren had a good heart and just needed encouragement. Lauren laughed a little and said she hoped there was something exciting in that safe. My heart sank at that. She should not have known anything was in there. I forced a smile, pretended none of it burned. This was what my family did. They created a world where Lauren always floated upward, even when logic said otherwise. I told myself not to take it personally, but there was something final about seeing that key in her hands. Dinner followed. Conversation drifted around Lauren while I stayed quiet. I caught Aunt Margaret's eyes across the table. She had joined us later in the evening and saw the entire exchange. She gave me a small look, a knowing one, the kind she had given me throughout my childhood when things tilted just a little too far in Lauren's favor. A look that said I was not imagining anything. After dinner, when the kitchen was mostly cleared, Aunt Margaret pulled me aside. She spoke softly, just loud enough that the sounds of my parents and Lauren in the living room masked our conversation. She told me she knew this must have stung. She said she did not understand why the responsibility had been handed to Lauren and not to me. She squeezed my arm and said what she had been saying since I was a girl, that I had always carried more than they realized, and one day it would all come into the light. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think this was just another moment I could swallow gracefully. But something in me felt unsettled, as if I had stepped into a story I did not fully recognize, one that had been playing out behind the scenes long before I arrived that day. Lauren drifted into the kitchen then, all smiles, talking about how she could not believe our parents trusted her with something so serious. She asked me, almost casually, if I remembered the old combination to the safe from years ago. She said it as if we were sharing a secret, a nostalgic memory, but it made my skin prickle. I told her I barely remembered anything about that period, and she brushed it off with a laugh, saying she was only curious. Later that night, as I lay in my old room listening to the faint sounds of holiday music downstairs, I replayed every detail: the velvet pouch, the key in her palm, the way she had asked about the safe, the way my parents' eyes softened for her in a way they never did for me. Something about it all felt too rehearsed. Outside, a faint wind rattled the windows. I stared at the ceiling and felt the quiet weight of a shift I could not yet name. If I had known what was coming next, how quickly the ground beneath all of us was about to break open, maybe I would not have tried so hard to talk myself into calmness. Instead, I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, holding on to the last thin thread of peace before the unraveling began. Morning came slowly, the pale winter light pushing through the curtains in a way that made everything look softer than it felt inside my chest. I lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet movements of the house. My mother always woke first, her footsteps steady as she moved between the kitchen and laundry room. My father followed, shuffling in that heavy way he did on cold mornings. Lauren rarely woke before 10, especially during the holidays, so the silence felt strangely fragile, like I needed to tiptoe through it. I got dressed and walked out to the hallway, the carpet colder than I remembered. Each step stirred memories I never asked for, small scenes that had settled inside me over decades whether I wanted them to or not. That old ache returned, not sharp or dramatic, but familiar the way a bruise remembers where it came from. My father was at the table with a mug of coffee when I entered the kitchen. He nodded at me without looking up from the newspaper. My mother turned when she heard me and said breakfast would be ready soon. Her voice had the same clipped warmth it always carried, polite but not quite affectionate. I told her I could help, but she shook her head and said everything was already handled. It reminded me of childhood mornings when I would ask the same question and get the same answer. Lauren would wander in half an hour later, making a mess of flour and milk while trying to make pancakes, and my mother would laugh and guide her hand. I used to wonder what it would feel like to be taught, instead of told to stay out of the way. The memory lingered as I poured myself a cup of coffee. Years collapsed into single images. Lauren on a step stool, helping our mother arrange cookies. Lauren crying over a broken ornament and getting a replacement the same afternoon. Lauren changing hobbies every 2 months and getting new supplies without hesitation. Meanwhile, I learned early that the safest way to avoid disappointment was to need nothing. It was funny how childhood stays with you even when you think you grew out of it. Sometimes it stays quiet, tucked into corners of the mind, until moments like the night before bring it all back into focus. I sat at the table, letting the steam from my cup warm my hands. My mother hummed to herself as she moved around the kitchen, and for once it was peaceful. Then Aunt Margaret stepped inside through the back door, wrapped in a thick coat with her hair slightly damp from the morning frost. She wiped her shoes carefully, glanced toward my father, then caught my eye. She had always been able to read me without trying. Even now, with years of distance, she saw what was happening before anyone else had to say a word. She settled into the chair beside mine and touched my arm lightly, as if confirming that I truly was there, and not just passing through. She asked how I slept. I told her it was fine, which was easier than explaining the tightness in my chest or the way old memories had pulled at me all night. She nodded slowly, studying my face in that sharp, intuitive way she had, then glanced toward the living room where the velvet pouch had been set on display. She leaned closer and said in a quiet voice that she had been thinking about last night. She said she understood why I seemed uneasy. She had watched the entire exchange from a distance, and something about it did not sit right with her either. She told me she did not believe responsibilities like that should be handed out based on who needed the most protection. She said I had always been the one who kept everything afloat, and that sometimes families confuse strength with an invitation to ignore someone's needs. Her words hit more deeply than I expected. I wanted to tell her it was fine, that I had learned to navigate whatever shape my family gave me, but I could not bring myself to lie to her. She squeezed my hand gently, her eyes filled with a mix of sympathy and frustration, then stood to help my mother with the plates. I tried to shake the feeling off as the morning went on, but the past kept resurfacing. I remembered being 16 and wanting to take a summer course in journalism, something that thrilled me more than any school project ever had. The fee was small, barely enough to matter, but my parents said it was unnecessary. They told me I should get a part-time job instead, something practical, something that would prepare me for real life. Weeks later, Lauren announced she wanted to try pottery classes. My mother drove her to the city twice a week for the entire summer and bought her a full set of tools by fall. I remembered being 20 and watching Lauren test out career after career without ever worrying about rent or bills. I had worked 2 jobs through college and taken on loans that I would carry well into my 30s. Lauren always had a safety net. I never did. Even in adulthood, when I finally moved to Seattle and began carving a life of my own, there were months when my parents would call, their voices hesitant as they asked if I could cover the electric bill or help with the property taxes for a little while. I always did. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself families help each other. I never questioned why the calls always came to me and not to Lauren. My mother set a plate in front of me and thanked me for coming home this year. She said it in a way that felt practiced, like a courtesy more than a feeling. My father joined in, making some comment about how he hoped the season would bring us closer together as a family. I smiled because it was easier than pointing out the cracks that had been there for decades. Lauren came downstairs with the same bright energy she carried everywhere she went. She slid into her seat and asked what we were planning for the day. My parents began listing small errands and later mentioned that Lauren should take a look at the safe so she could get familiar with how it worked. Then Lauren turned to me and asked with a casual tone if I remembered when Dad changed the combination years ago. She said she thought I helped him reset it once, though she could not recall exactly when. I stared at her for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Her eyes were curious, but too curious, almost searching. I told her I barely remembered anything about that time. She waved it off and said she was only wondering. It did not make sense to me. Lauren had the key now. The combination did not matter unless she felt uncertain about something or had more questions than she was letting on. Aunt Margaret looked up from her coffee, her eyes moving between us. She did not say anything, but I felt her watching Lauren closely. Breakfast continued with light conversation, but my thoughts were elsewhere. The memory of Lauren asking about the combination mixed with the look she gave me last night, both of them swirling together in a way that made my nerves tighten. Later, while everyone prepared to leave the house for errands, Margaret pulled me aside near the hallway. She told me to trust my instincts, that something about all of this felt odd. She said Lauren had always been reckless with things she did not understand, and that responsibility meant something different to her than it did to me. I asked Margaret why she thought our parents made the decision so easily. She sighed in that patient way she had, and said that some parents convince themselves that the child who struggles the most should be handed responsibility, in hopes it will help them grow. But often it is the child who gives and gives who is overlooked because strength looks like independence, and independence looks like not needing anyone. Her words were heavy, but they made sense in a way that unsettled me. I wanted to ask her more, but my father called from the doorway asking if we were ready. I gathered my coat and followed them outside into the cold. the air carrying that sharp December bite. Lauren walked ahead, humming, spinning the safe key on her finger before slipping it into her pocket. My mother fussed over her scarf. My father locked the door behind us. As we stepped into the driveway, something in me shifted. The feeling was small but undeniable, a quiet awareness settling into my chest. I did not know what was coming or how deeply the coming days would test every piece of what I understood about this family. I only knew that the ground beneath us was not as steady as it looked. I climbed into my car and waited for the others to get into theirs, staring at the house I had once believed held the shape of home. Something about it felt different now, as if the walls themselves were holding a story I had not yet heard, a story waiting for its moment to break open. I stayed there in the driver's seat for a moment longer than I meant to, watching the others move around their car while a thin sheet of cold air drifted across the driveway. Lauren was laughing at something my mother said, her breath forming little clouds as she tugged her gloves on. My father tapped the hood of his pickup like he always did before he drove anywhere, a habit he picked up years ago during a winter when the engine used to stall. Everything looked ordinary from the outside, but a heaviness settled in my stomach as I turned the key and pulled out behind them. We drove in a small caravan toward the grocery store. My father led, Lauren and my mother followed, and I hovered behind them like the third car in a parade no one asked for. Christmas errands were the same every year. My mother liked to shop early before the crowds formed. She said people forgot their manners as the day went on. She preferred morning hours when the world felt calmer. Inside the store, the warmth was almost jarring, and the bright lights reflected off every shiny surface. I grabbed a cart and kept a small distance behind them as they went through the aisles. My mother narrated her list out loud, checking it twice for no real reason. Richard nodded like a man trying to follow a language he had never learned. Lauren floated beside them, touching ribbons and scented candles and little seasonal trinkets she had no intention of buying. I followed out of habit, not necessity. This was the role I always played. The helper, the quiet one, the one who stepped in when something heavy needed lifting, or when a price needed comparing, or when a decision needed a practical voice. I fell back into it automatically, but now there was a new undertone, a quiet question that kept brushing the back of my mind. Why hand the key to Lauren? Why now? Why like that? Odd how a single moment could reshape the ground beneath a lifetime of habit. I must have drifted too far into my thoughts because my mother suddenly called for me from the end of the aisle. Emily, grabbed those cranberries. She never asked Lauren for things like that. I walked over, placed them in the cart, and stepped aside again. My mother smiled like she was proud of how smoothly everything was going. Lauren picked up a jar of cinnamon sticks and twirled it in her hand. Then she said something that I almost missed at first. She wondered out loud whether the safe had more money than she originally thought. She said it casually, but her eyes flicked toward me. My father frowned a little as if the comment caught him off guard, but he let it pass. I felt a small spark of unease. She should not have been speculating about the contents of the safe at all. She had barely been given the key for 12 hours. As we left the store, the clouds thickened. A flurry of snow drifted down. My father carried the heavier bags. My mother fussed over the cold, and Lauren walked ahead humming, her boots crunching lightly against the pavement. I watched her as she talked animatedly about redesigning her studio next year. She had a habit of speaking big while acting small. She dreamt loudly, but when it came to following through, she always seemed to land softly on someone else's cushion. At home, the morning slid into midday. My father began checking outdoor lights again, muttering under his breath while adjusting a bulb that flickered for reasons no one understood. My mother moved between the kitchen and living room, arranging platters of cookies and small bowls of nuts and chocolates. Lauren wandered between tasks, conveniently avoiding anything that required effort, but jumping in for anything decorative. I tried to help with dishes, but my mother insisted she had it under control. I found myself standing alone near the dining room window for a brief moment, watching the yard where Lauren and I used to play as children. My reflection stared back at me, older, steadier, carrying the weight of years that had stretched long without anyone noticing. Aunt Margaret arrived shortly after noon with her usual brisk energy. She carried a tin of cookies and brushed snow from her shoulders before stepping inside. She greeted everyone, then pulled me into a quick hug that had more genuine warmth than anything else I had received that morning. She looked me over carefully, as if scanning for cracks. I assured her I was fine. She did not believe me, but she let it slide. At one point, Lauren called from the hallway asking if anyone had seen her scarf. She said she needed it before going outside again. My mother rushed to help her look, even though the scarf was hanging exactly where Lauren always left her things. I watched the scene from the kitchen doorway and felt that same old tug, patterns woven so tightly into the fabric of this house they could never fully unravel. Later, while Aunt Margaret and I chopped vegetables for dinner, she lowered her voice and asked whether I felt strange about last night. I hesitated, then nodded. She shook her head slowly and said she had been turning it over in her mind since she saw it. She said the decision felt rushed, and not like something my parents would normally do. She paused her chopping and said that handing the safe key to someone so untested did not make sense. She said, if anything, my father had always treated financial responsibilities as something for people who earned trust, not hoped for it. She studied me with that piercing look she had, the one that stripped everything down to its bones. She asked if Lauren knew more about the safe than she let on. I told her about Lauren asking me whether I remembered the old combination. Margaret frowned and said that question was not innocent. She said Lauren could not stand feeling left out and would do anything to regain control if she thought someone else knew something she did not. Before I could respond, Lauren breezed into the kitchen with her scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. She leaned against the counter and said she might stop by her studio later to check on an order. My mother glanced back with concern and asked whether that was a good idea with the weather changing. Lauren rolled her eyes and said she could handle it. She then shifted her gaze to me, her tone light but her eyes too calculating. She mentioned again the safe and how nice it felt to finally be trusted with something important. She said she hoped she would not mess anything up. I offered a non-committal smile, but Margaret's eyes sharpened. She had caught something in Lauren's voice, some small imbalance that others ignored because they were used to it. The afternoon continued, though my thoughts drifted often. For a moment the house felt smaller, the air felt heavier. I kept sensing something shifting beneath the surface, a fault line readying itself. While we prepared a tray of appetizers, my father called out from the living room that the garage camera had gone out again. He complained that he had checked the wiring only a month ago and did not understand why it kept shutting off. My mother said she would ask Kyle to look at it since he sometimes helped with little repairs in the neighborhood. My father muttered that the camera was old anyway, and maybe it was time to replace it. Lauren popped in, asking what was wrong, and when my father explained, she shrugged like it was nothing. I watched her lightly, noticing the quick glance she gave toward the back hallway that led to the room where the safe was kept. There was no reason for her to care whether the camera worked. No reason unless she had something to hide or something she had not quite planned out. As the day stretched on, I found myself walking through memories again. All the moments when I had been the solution instead of the child. All the times Lauren stumbled and someone caught her before she fell. All the unseen pieces of me that had held this family steady year after year, while no one noticed my hands shaking. I set the last bowl on the counter and stepped back. Wiping my palms on a towel, Margaret brushed past and whispered that something was coming, something that might explain what I had been feeling since the night before. She said patterns only stay hidden until the moment they force themselves into the light. Before I could ask what she meant, the sound of Lauren laughing rang from the hallway. I looked over and saw her pull the safe key from her pocket, spinning it once before tucking it back away. She caught my eyes for a brief second. Her smile was soft but unreadable. The house grew strangely quiet in that moment, as if everything paused just long enough for me to feel the shift. I turned away and focused on the tray in front of me, trying to ignore the small chill that ran along my spine. The day was far from over, and something told me it was only getting started. The rest of the afternoon moved in a quiet rhythm that did not match the unease building inside me. Everyone settled into their usual holiday habits. My mother baked as if feeding an entire neighborhood. My father disappeared outside to adjust the lights one more time. Aunt Margaret read a magazine on the couch, pausing every now and then to watch the household with that steady, knowing gaze of hers. Lauren floated through each room, humming a tune that grew sweeter every time someone looked at her. I stayed busy with small tasks, grateful for anything that kept my hands moving. By late afternoon, the temperature dropped enough that the windows fogged along the edges. My father stepped inside from the yard, stomping snow off his boots and rubbing his hands together for warmth. He told us the lights looked good enough for now, though the strand along the right side kept flickering in a way that made him nervous. My mother teased him for caring too much about decorations, and he laughed under his breath, the kind of soft laugh that came from years of learning to choose peace over arguing. I went upstairs to grab a scarf I had left in my old room. The hallway was dim and quiet, and the carpet muffled my footsteps. I found the scarf folded on the bed where I had placed it that morning and draped it around my neck. As I stepped back into the hallway, something in the corner of my eye made me pause. Down the hall, past the empty guest room and the linen closet, the small door to the utility room stood slightly open. No one used that room except to store cleaning supplies and a few old holiday boxes. It had no reason to be open. I walked toward it slowly. The closer I got, the more certain I felt that I had not imagined it. The door was cracked just enough to reveal a sliver of shadow inside. I pushed it a little wider. Nothing seemed out of place. A stack of folded blankets, a shelf with paint cans, an old vacuum leaning against the wall. I let the door fall shut and forced myself to breathe normally. The safe room was on the opposite side of the house. This was nothing. I told myself it was nothing. I headed downstairs, where the sounds of the house gathered again. My mother had Christmas music playing in the background while she chopped herbs. My father was studying a manual for the garage door opener, though every time I glanced in his direction, he seemed more confused than before. Aunt Margaret offered commentary from her seat on the couch. Lauren passed through carrying a mug of hot chocolate, singing softly like a performer on a stage only she could see. After helping finish some food prep, I stepped toward the back hallway to grab a serving tray. Passing the door to the safe room, I slowed. The handle was cool beneath my fingertips. Nothing unusual, but something pulled at me. I eased the door open just a little. The room was darker than the hallway. Only a faint band of light from the window cut across the carpet. The safe sat against the far wall, square and gray with the slight sheen of cold metal. Everything looked untouched, but the air felt unsettled, as if someone had been there not long before. I heard footsteps behind me and turned. Lauren came around the corner, eyebrows raised, lips parted just enough to form a curious expression. She asked what I was doing. I stepped aside and said I had only been looking for the serving tray. She smiled, a soft, innocent smile meant to look harmless. She told me Mom had moved the trays to the dining room last week. Then she leaned a little, glancing past me into the safe room, and said that she had just checked the safe earlier to make sure she remembered how the lock worked. She said it lightly, but there was a brightness in her eyes that made my skin prickle. I nodded and walked past her, pretending it meant nothing. Later in the day, the snow began falling harder. My father announced he was going out to shovel again. My mother fretted about the storm picking up overnight. Aunt Margaret wrapped herself in a blanket and insisted the weather would clear by morning. Lauren put on her coat and said she wanted to step out to the porch for some fresh air. I followed to help my father with the walkway. The wind cut through my jacket as I stepped outside. My father was halfway down the driveway already, scraping layers of snow with short, firm strokes. I picked up the second shovel and joined him. For a while, neither of us talked. The snow fell steadily, and the sound of shovels scraping against concrete filled the space between us. Eventually, he spoke, asking quietly if the job in Seattle was still going well. I nodded and told him it was. He said he was proud of me. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the wind, and he did not look up as he said it. I thanked him. It was rare to hear those words from him, and even rarer to know what to do with them. When the driveway was mostly clear, he pointed to the garage and said he needed to check something. The door was already partially open. As we walked toward it, a flicker of movement caught my eye, the faintest shift of shadow near the side wall. Then I saw the light above the inside doorway blink out for a moment before returning. My father muttered about the electrical wiring again. He walked over to inspect it while I stood by the workbench waiting for some sense of normalcy to return. The faint smell of cold concrete and motor oil filled the space. Tools hung on the wall in neat rows. An old cardboard box sat near the safe room door, though I did not remember it being there the night before. Before I could look closer, a voice called out behind us. It was Kyle, our neighbor, strolling across the driveway holding a small padded envelope. He waved, then stepped inside the garage to hand it to my father, some holiday gift that had arrived at the wrong address. Kyle chatted for a moment before his eyes drifted around the garage. He seemed surprised to see the light working. He mentioned casually that he had seen it flicker last night too. He said he thought maybe someone had gone in late because he saw movement near the side wall around 10. He thought it might have been my father. My father shook his head and said he had been in bed by then. I asked Kyle if he was sure about the time. He nodded without hesitation. He had been walking his dog and saw a figure by the garage, someone petite wearing a long coat. He assumed it was either me or Lauren. He said it lightly, as if it was nothing more than a neighborly observation. My father shrugged it off. I felt something tighten in my stomach. We thanked him and he walked back across the yard. My father went inside first. I lingered in the garage for a moment, staring at the box near the safe room door. It was old and taped shut. Maybe it had been there all along. Maybe I had simply never noticed. Or maybe someone had moved it recently and had not meant to draw attention to it. When I stepped back inside the house, the warmth hit me again. My mother was laying out appetizers and humming along to a song on the radio. Lauren was seated on the couch, legs curled under her, scrolling her phone while the safe key glinted from her pocket. She looked up at me and smiled, a soft and airy smile that did nothing to quiet the unease swirling inside me. I moved to help Margaret in the kitchen, trying to shake the strange weight settling across my shoulders. Something about the afternoon felt off balance, as if the house was shifting around me quietly, preparing for a moment none of us were ready for. I arranged the cut vegetables on a platter, heard footsteps behind me, and felt the air shift in that small, unmistakable way. The kind of shift that tells you a story is already in motion, and you are standing right at the edge of its beginning. I turned toward the sound, expecting to see Margaret coming in from the living room, but it was my father standing in the doorway. His face had lost its usual color, and for a moment he looked older than I had ever seen him. He asked all of us to come into the safe room. His voice was tight and controlled the way it got when something serious had gone wrong. My mother froze in place. Lauren paused mid-scroll and slowly set her phone down. A thin ribbon of dread slid across my skin. We followed him down the short hallway. The air grew colder the closer we got, as if the house itself was bracing for something. When he opened the door, the room felt strangely hollow. The single window offered a pale strip of winter light that cut across the carpet. The safe sat in the corner where it always had. The metal looked duller today, almost bruised. My father knelt in front of it and pulled the handle. The heavy door swung open with a slow groan. He stared inside for several seconds without speaking. My mother stepped forward and asked if something was wrong. He did not answer right away. He reached inside, moved his hand across the empty shelf, then stood abruptly. The envelope he always kept at the back was gone. The cash that he had counted earlier in the week, nearly $13,000 for taxes and roof repairs, had vanished. My mother gasped and brought her hand to her mouth. Lauren whispered a shaky question, asking if he was sure. Maybe he moved it somewhere, maybe he forgot. But my father shook his head. He kept his records meticulous. He knew exactly where everything should be. There was no mistake. The money was gone. For a moment, no one moved, as if shock had rooted us to the floor. Then my father turned slowly in my direction. His expression was not angry yet, but deeply confused, hurt in a way that pierced through me. He asked if I had been in the room sometime earlier without mentioning it. I stepped back, startled, and told him no, I had not touched the safe in years. Lauren wrapped her arms around herself. Her voice went soft and trembling. She said she had only checked the key earlier to make sure she understood the lock, but she had not opened the safe since the night before. My mother stepped beside her and rubbed her back as if comforting a child frightened by a bad dream. I felt the shift happen the way a person might feel the first crack of ice beneath their feet. One small fracture, then another, then everything beginning to tilt. My father cleared his throat. He reminded me that I used to help manage their bills and had known the old combination long before Lauren had the key. I reminded him that I had not lived in the house for years and that the combination had been changed twice since then. He stared at me with a searching expression, as if trying to fit pieces of a puzzle together, even though they did not belong to the same picture. Lauren spoke again, quieter this time. She mentioned that she saw me near the safe room yesterday when I was helping with boxes. She said she had not thought anything of it then. Her tone was hesitant, like she was offering information she wished were not true. My mother stiffened. I started to defend myself, but my father raised a hand. asking everyone to stay calm. He rubbed the bridge of his nose the way he always did when a headache formed. He said we needed to think this through logically. Only a handful of people had access to the safe. Only a handful of people even knew how it worked. I reminded him that Lauren was the only one with the key. Lauren looked wounded. She held up the key as if it were proof of innocence. She said she had never used it except to look inside for a second the previous night. My mother nodded sympathetically and muttered that Lauren would never do something so foolish. Their certainty about her innocence hit me harder than the quiet suspicion directed at me. My father continued pacing, muttering about how the safe had never been opened improperly before. Then he paused and looked straight at me. He asked again if there was anything I needed to tell him. Something financial, some emergency I had not shared. I shook my head. My voice sounded smaller than I wanted, but I forced the words out. I told him I had no reason to take anything from this house. The silence that followed stretched thin until it felt painful. My mother finally spoke. Her voice was cool, gentler than anger, but colder than disappointment. She asked if I was struggling with something back in Seattle. She said no one would judge me if I needed help. She said people sometimes act desperately when they are embarrassed to admit difficulties. I stared at her. I wondered if she truly believed what she was saying, or if it was simply easier to imagine me at fault than to imagine Lauren misusing a responsibility she had never earned. I felt heat rising in my chest. I swallowed it down. I told them again that I had not touched the safe. I told them I would never do something like that. My father said he wanted to believe me. The way he said it cut deeper than if he had simply called me a liar. Aunt Margaret stepped forward then. Her face was stern, focused. She said that accusing anyone without thinking this through would only make matters worse. She reminded everyone that door locks fail, cameras malfunction, and assumptions are dangerous when emotions run high. She suggested they consider every possibility before drawing conclusions. But her voice landed softly in a room already pointed in a single direction. My father sighed heavily and said we would look again. Search the room, the hall, the adjoining closet. Maybe the envelope had fallen or been moved accidentally. We searched quietly, methodically, opening drawers, moving boxes, checking behind shelves. Nothing showed up. The money was simply gone. My mother sat down on the edge of the bed in the nearby guest room. Her eyes glazed. She whispered about how they needed that money for taxes next month, how they could not fall behind again, how this house could not handle any more financial strain. Lauren wrapped her arms around her. She repeated that she had only wanted to help, only wanted to do a good job with the responsibility they had given her. She kept glancing at me in short, nervous bursts. Margaret and I stood in the doorway. I felt her watching me from the corner of her eye. She was piecing things together too. My father finally stopped pacing. He stood in the center of the room, rubbing his jaw in small, tight circles. He said someone must have taken it. There was no other explanation. And if someone in the family took it, that someone needed to speak up before things escalated? The word escalated echoed sharply in the air. My throat tightened. I told him again that I did not take anything. I said it quietly but firmly. He looked at me for a long moment, then at Lauren, then back at me. I could feel the balance tipping even before he opened his mouth. He told me not to panic, that if I was in trouble he could help, that there were ways to fix things if I was honest. The pain that shot through me was sharp and humiliating. Not because he thought I was a thief, but because he thought I needed to be handled gently, that I could not be trusted to speak truth unless cornered. Lauren whispered that maybe I had been overwhelmed lately. Maybe I misunderstood something. She offered the words like soft cushions meant to break a fall she believed I was already taking. I stepped back and shook my head. My voice trembled, but I held on to it. I told them I would not stay in a room where everyone spoke to me like I was guilty of something I did not do. My father sighed the way he always did when he believed I was being unreasonable. My mother whispered that I should take a moment to collect myself. Lauren watched me with wide eyes and a trembling lower lip. I walked out of the room before any more words could find their shape. In the hallway, the air felt thin. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. Margaret came to me quietly. She touched my arm and shook her head. She said she did not believe a word of their assumptions. She said she knew I was telling the truth. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were worried. I heard footsteps approaching from behind, the slow, heavy ones that belonged to my father. I straightened just in time to see him appear in the doorway. He looked torn, exhausted, confused. He asked me to stay available while they figured things out. He said they needed clarity. He said they needed honesty. I nodded because arguing with him in that moment felt pointless. I stepped past him and made my way upstairs. In my old room, I closed the door and stood there motionless, my heart beating too fast for the silence that surrounded me. The air felt colder than it had earlier, sharper somehow. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting on my knees, the weight of the accusations settling into my bones. I knew the night was not finished with us. I knew this was only the first crack in something larger. I looked toward the window, watching the snow fall thicker, heavier, as if the sky itself was preparing to bury whatever truth waited beneath it. I stayed there watching the snowfall until the shapes outside blurred into one soft white sheet. But the quiet did nothing to steady me. I could hear the faint murmur of voices drifting up from downstairs, rising and falling in tones I knew too well. My family had a way of talking about problems when the person they blamed was no longer in the room. I wondered how many times my name was said in those hushed conversations, softened by sympathy for the wrong daughter and suspicion toward the right one. After several minutes, I stood and paced slowly across the room. The carpet felt rougher than I remembered. The air felt tighter. I tried to tell myself that this would settle, that logic would eventually win out, that they would realize how absurd it was to accuse me, but I also knew patterns. I knew the grooves this family lived in. I knew how easily they slipped into fear, inconvenience, and denial. A soft knock broke into my thoughts. My mother stepped inside without waiting for my answer. She closed the door behind her and took a careful breath, the kind a person takes before delivering bad news. Her expression was strained in a way that made my heart ache even as frustration curled inside me. She sat on the edge of the bed and folded her hands in her lap. She said they were not trying to hurt me. She said they were confused and stressed and frightened about what the loss of the money meant. She said the timing was terrible, that the property taxes needed to be paid soon, and my father had been worried about them for weeks. She said all of this as if it explained something. I asked her why she was telling me again. She hesitated, then said they needed to understand what happened and that my father wanted to talk to me downstairs. Her voice softened. She said that if something happened, anything at all, I should tell them now before things got worse. The words cut deeper than before, sharper because they were wrapped in false gentleness. I told her I had nothing to confess. She looked down, exhaling a long, tired breath. Then she stood and touched my shoulder lightly. She said she hoped I would choose honesty. After she left, I pressed my hands to my face, willing myself not to break. There was a brief moment when I thought about packing my things right then, walking out without a goodbye, without an explanation, but leaving in the middle of the storm outside would only fuel their certainty. They would see flight as guilt. They would tell themselves the story that required the least effort to understand. So I stayed still. Another knock came, louder this time. It was my father. He did not step inside, only asked me to join them in the living room. I followed him down the stairs, each step landing like a stone in my chest. The living room was too bright. My mother and Lauren sat side by side on the couch. Aunt Margaret remained in the armchair near the window, her expression firm but unreadable. My father stood until I entered, then gestured for me to sit. I stayed standing. He cleared his throat and repeated the facts. The money was gone. The safe had not been forced open. Only 2 people had access to it, one with a key and one with prior knowledge. He kept his tone calm, but every word felt heavy. I asked if he truly believed I had done this. He said he did not want to believe anything yet, only wanted to understand. He said that if the money was taken out of need or desperation, we could work through it. Lauren whispered that she knew how hard life in the city could be and that she would not judge me. I stared at her. She looked away quickly. My father asked me again if there was anything I needed to tell him, something that would make sense of all this. He said he would rather hear it from me than be forced to involve anyone else. A cold rush ran through me. I asked him what he meant by anyone else. He avoided my eyes. Lauren shifted uncomfortably. My mother folded her arms, the signal she always gave when she had made up her mind even if she would not say it aloud. They were already considering calling authorities, not because they wanted justice, but because they wanted reassurance, because believing I had done something terrible was easier than believing they had trusted the wrong daughter. My voice trembled, but I spoke clearly. I told them I did not take the money. I told them there was nothing I needed to explain. I told them I had come home to celebrate Christmas, not to be interrogated. My father said this was not an interrogation. Aunt Margaret snorted quietly at that, her disbelief slipping out before she could stop it. She told him that he was handling this poorly, that he was letting panic speak louder than reason. He frowned at her, but did not contradict her. Lauren rose from the couch then, her voice shaky but theatrical in a way that made my stomach twist. She said that when she checked the safe last night, everything was fine. She said she had locked it with the key and put the key back in her pocket. She said she did not understand how anyone else could have opened it unless they already knew the combination. Her eyes slid towards me again. It was subtle but unmistakable. I felt something crumble inside me. I turned to my father and told him that staying in this conversation was pointless if everyone had already decided I was guilty. He insisted that no one had decided anything. The lie sat heavy in the air. I said I needed air and walked out before anyone could stop me. Outside, the cold hit me like a wave. The sky was fading into a deep blue, and snowflakes drifted down in thicker patterns. I walked down the driveway, my boots crunching against the new layer of snow. Behind me, the front door opened. I heard light footsteps and knew immediately they belonged to Lauren. She called out, asking me to wait. I did not turn. She caught up anyway, wrapping her arms tightly around herself as she approached. She said she was sorry things were getting so intense. She said she hated seeing me upset. She said she hoped I understood that she had no choice but to tell her parents what she saw yesterday. I turned to her then. I reminded her that she saw nothing. She blinked, her expression flickering just long enough to betray something she had been hiding. She said she only meant that she had seen me near the safe room and thought it might matter. I asked her why she mentioned the old combination if she believed I had never opened the safe recently. She faltered. Her eyes darted away. She said she had just been curious. I felt myself inching toward anger, a rare kind that came from years of swallowing small humiliations. I wanted to ask her why she was doing this. But before I could speak, she wrapped her arms around herself again and said it would be easier if I just explained what happened. She looked at me then with that pleading expression she used as a child, the one that always made our parents rush to soothe her. She said she knew I must have had a reason. For a moment, the wind stilled. I looked at her and saw the story she was building, piece by piece, each one placed carefully where it would shield her and frame me. I told her I would not carry her mistakes. She stepped back like the words had slapped her. She opened her mouth to speak again, but no sound came out. I walked back towards the house without waiting for her. Inside, the warmth felt suffocating. My father stood near the bottom of the stairs. He said he thought it best if I stayed in my room until they figured out what to do next. Not as punishment, he said, just to keep things calm. I nodded because the alternative was to scream. In my room, I closed the door and leaned against it. The storm outside pressed against the windows, but the quiet in the room was louder. I sat on the bed and stared at the suitcase in the corner. I unzipped it and began placing my clothes back inside one by one. Not angrily, not hurried, just with the slow certainty of someone who had reached the limit of what she could endure. When the last sweater was folded, I sat back on my heels and breathed in the stillness. I knew what I needed to do. I knew there was no staying after this. The only question left was how to walk away without looking back. I zipped the suitcase halfway and sat there staring at it, feeling the familiar mix of defeat and clarity settle over me. For years, I had told myself that if things ever grew too heavy, if the imbalance ever became too sharp to ignore, I would leave without hesitation. Yet sitting on that old carpet with my clothes folded neatly inside a suitcase felt far heavier than I ever imagined. Something in me resisted the finality of it, even as another part knew I had already crossed the point of return. I pulled myself together, stood, and lifted the suitcase upright. The weight of it steadied me. I opened the bedroom door quietly, listening for voices downstairs. The house was silent for the first time all day, a silence too calm to be comforting. I walked down the hall and descended the stairs, each step feeling like it belonged to a version of me I was shedding in real time. My father was in the living room, his back to me as he stared at the darkened Christmas tree. My mother stood in the doorway to the kitchen, arms folded, eyes fixed on the floor. Lauren was nowhere in sight, though I suspected she was hovering somewhere close enough to listen if she wanted to. I cleared my throat and told them I needed to go back to Seattle. I said it plainly, no excuses, no softening. My father turned with a startled look, as if he had not expected the possibility. He asked if we could talk first. I told him we already had. Not in words, maybe, but in everything that had unfolded that evening. My mother tried to reason with me, saying it was late and the weather was bad. I told her I would drive carefully. She looked at me with a mix of fear and frustration. The same expression she wore the day I moved out after college. The same expression she wore whenever I stopped fitting neatly into the space she thought I should occupy. Lauren stepped out from the hallway then, her face pale. She told me I was overreacting. She said families fight and misunderstand each other, especially during stressful moments. She said leaving would only make everything harder to fix. I stared at her, searching for a trace of the sister I used to defend when we were children, a trace of someone who might understand what it felt like to be blamed for a crime you did not commit. All I saw was fear, not for me but for herself. I wheeled the suitcase toward the door. My father walked after me and placed a hand on the handle. He asked me one more time if there was anything I needed to say. His voice was soft, pleading even, but it still carried the same implication. Tell me what you did. Tell me why. Tell me something that makes this make sense. I pulled the suitcase gently from his grip. I told him I had said everything I needed to say. I told him I had not taken the money, and that staying in a house where no one believed me was not something I could do. He looked at me with a devastation I did not have room to absorb. I stepped out into the cold, the wind cutting across my face, as if welcoming me back to the only kind of honesty I had left. I loaded the suitcase into the back of my car. The yard looked smaller than I remembered. The roofline, the porch, the driveway, all of it suddenly belonged to a past life. I climbed into the driver's seat and shut the door, letting the quiet wrap around me. The engine started with a low hum. Snow drifted lightly across the windshield. For a moment I stared at the house, thinking of all the versions of myself I had left inside those walls. Then I shifted into reverse and backed out onto the street. I had not been driving more than a mile when my phone buzzed in the cup holder. I ignored it at first, focusing on the slick pavement and the curve of the road. It rang again, this time followed by a notification chime. At the next stoplight, I picked it up. It was a text from my mother. She wrote that she hoped I would calm down soon, and that when I did, I needed to remember to pay the internet bill for the house because the auto payment was still under my account. She added a brief line that taxes were coming up and that she hoped I would not forget how stressful it was for them. I stared at the message until the light turned green and the car behind me honked. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down, not from anger this time, but from a kind of clarity that felt almost painful in its simplicity. The accusation had not been the breaking point. This message was. It was proof that in their eyes my value had always been tied to what I provided: money, labor, stability, all the invisible work that made their lives easier. Even as they suspected me of stealing, they still trusted me to pay the bills. I drove north towards Seattle, the highway quiet beneath the falling snow. A numb calm settled in as the miles passed. I thought of my small apartment waiting for me, the life I had built piece by piece. I thought of the friends I had chosen, the independence I had fought for. I thought of how none of that seemed to matter inside my parents' house, because they still saw me through a lens that had never been fair to begin with. By the time I reached the city limits, my eyes burned with exhaustion. The skyline appeared in the distance, its familiar glow cutting through the storm. I exhaled a breath I felt I had been holding since childhood. I drove through the quiet streets toward the hospital where my friend Tessa worked the night shift. I did not want to be alone just yet, not with everything still pressing against me like a weight I could not carry. She opened her apartment door before I could knock twice. She took one look at my face and pulled me inside without a word. I sank onto her couch. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a warm mug of tea. I held it in both hands, grateful for something steady. She waited until I finished the first sip before asking what happened. Her voice was gentle but firm, the voice of someone trained to handle emergencies and heartbreak in equal measure. I told her everything. The accusations, the safe, the looks, the message. Every detail fell out of me like water breaking through a cracked dam. Tessa listened without interrupting. When I finished, she sat back and let out a slow breath. She said she was sorry, not in the way people say it when they do not know what else to say, but in a way that told me she understood exactly how deeply this cut. She asked if I was planning to go back. I shook my head before she finished the question. She nodded. She said I could stay as long as I needed and that we would figure out the rest later. For the first time all day, my chest loosened. I leaned back into the couch, letting the warm air of her apartment melt the cold that had settled in my bones. Eventually, she stood and said she needed to grab something from her room. When she returned, she handed me an extra blanket and told me to get some sleep. She would be back in a few hours once her shift ended. I nodded, unable to say much more. When she left, I curled up under the blanket and let my eyes close. The exhaustion dragged me under quickly. The last thing I remember before slipping into sleep was the steady hum of the radiator and the faint glow of the city outside the window, a reminder that some places in this world could still feel like refuge. I slept without dreaming until something small and sharp nudged me awake. I opened my eyes slowly, unsure of what had woken me. For a moment, I lay still beneath the blanket on Tessa's couch, listening to the quiet hum of her apartment. The city sounds outside were faint, softened by the storm that had moved in overnight. A soft tapping came again, this time from my phone on the coffee table. I reached for it, blinking at the brightness. There were 3 missed calls from my father, 2 from my mother, 1 from an unknown number in Tacoma, a text from Lauren asking if I was safe, another from my father saying we needed to talk immediately. My stomach clenched at the sight of them. I let the phone fall back onto the table and pressed my palms against my eyes. For a few minutes, I sat there letting the weight of everything settle again. Leaving that house had felt like ripping out a root I had never acknowledged, and waking up away from it brought equal parts relief and sorrow. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and listened as the apartment creaked gently in the morning wind. When Tessa returned from her shift a little after 8, she set her keys on the counter and walked straight over. She asked if I had slept, and I nodded. She asked if I had heard from my family, and I nodded again. She sighed, sat down beside me, and waited until I lifted my head. She said I should not talk to them until I understood the full situation. She said people react out of fear when money goes missing, and fear makes them say things they cannot take back. I told her they had already said enough. She reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts, then told me she knew an attorney who handled civil disputes, someone named Daniel Price. She said he was patient and practical and would know exactly what my options were. She asked if I wanted her to call him. I hesitated only a moment before agreeing. Daniel arrived at her apartment later that morning. He had a gentle voice and clear eyes that made him easy to trust. He sat across from me in the small living room with a notepad balanced on his knee. He asked me to walk him through everything in order, every detail, every suspicion, every moment when something felt off. So I told him about the key, the safe, the flickering garage camera, Kyle mentioning someone going into the garage at 10, Lauren asking about the old combination, the accusations, the text message about the internet bill that somehow cut deeper than everything else combined. He listened without interrupting, taking notes with slow, deliberate movements. When I finished, he leaned back and took a thoughtful breath. He told me that families sometimes let emotions cloud judgment, but accusations involving missing money could spiral quickly. He asked if my parents had mentioned contacting law enforcement. I told him they might have been considering it. His expression tightened. He said that before anything escalated, he wanted to verify the facts. He asked if anyone besides Lauren had access to the safe. I said no. She had the only key. He asked if the combination had changed. I said yes, several times. He nodded slowly. He asked about the garage camera. I told him my father said it had malfunctioned, but Kyle claimed it was flickering the night before the money disappeared. Daniel wrote that down carefully. Then he asked to speak with Kyle if possible. He said independent observations mattered when emotions were high. He asked me what I wanted to do. The question took me by surprise. For a moment, I stared at my hands, remembering the look in my father's eyes, the tremble in my mother's voice, the panic in Lauren's. I told him I wanted the truth. Nothing more. He stood and slid his notepad into his coat. He said he would drive to Tacoma that afternoon. He said he wanted to speak to Kyle and look at the property layout himself. He said he would call me before confronting anyone so that I would not be blindsided. When he left, the apartment felt strangely larger. The hours that followed passed slowly. I made tea. I rearranged the blanket. I stared out the window at the falling snow. The city felt cold and clean, nothing like the house I had left behind. I had begun piecing myself back together when my phone buzzed. It was Daniel. He said he had spoken with Kyle, He said Kyle confirmed he saw someone matching Lauren's height and coat inside the garage around 10, the night before the money vanished. He said Kyle had hesitated earlier because he did not want to involve himself in family matters. But after hearing what happened, he agreed to share everything he remembered. Daniel's voice grew more serious. He said the garage camera was not malfunctioning. It had been manually disabled. The cable had been unplugged, not torn, not broken, pulled out. My breath caught. I stared at the window without seeing anything. Daniel continued. He said he had also looked at the financial records my parents had mentioned. He said there was a credit card under Lauren's name with several overdue charges. One transaction in particular stood out, a cash withdrawal of $3,000 at an ATM 2 miles from her interior design studio. The timestamp on the receipt matched the exact period when the garage camera had been turned off. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me. Daniel asked if I was sitting down. I told him yes. Though my legs were trembling, he said he had one more detail, something he wanted to verify before showing it to my parents. He said that Lauren had recently made several purchases for her studio, including supplies and materials that exceeded her reported income. He said someone had to be covering those costs, and it did not appear to be her. My pulse throbbed in my ears. A cold clarity washed over me, sharp and clean. The truth was no longer a fog. It was taking shape. Daniel said he planned to contact my parents that evening. He said he would not accuse anyone directly, only present the inconsistencies and ask them to reconsider the assumptions they had made. He said he expected resistance, but believed the facts were strong enough to push through. After we ended the call, I sat very still, letting the words replay in my mind. Lauren in the garage, the unplugged camera, the ATM withdrawal, the purchases, the debt, the theater of innocence, the gentle trembling voice, the way she looked at me when she said she had seen me near the safe room. For a long moment, I closed my eyes and let the truth settle, heavy but strangely grounding. I was not imagining things. I was not overreacting. I was not the problem. The sun had begun to set when Tessa returned from running errands. She found me sitting at the table with a cup of tea I had forgotten to drink. She asked if Daniel had called. I nodded. She waited. When I told her the details, her expression changed from concern to anger, then softened into something I could only describe as relief for me. She sat beside me and let out a deep breath. She said it was time to stop carrying everything alone. Night fell completely. The city lights flickered in the window. I felt a stillness I had not felt in days. Not peace exactly, but a sense of direction, a beginning. Then my phone lit up again. This time it was Daniel. His voice was calm but urgent. He said he had just spoken with my parents. He said they had not handled it well. He said he needed to meet with me first thing in the morning. He said there was more, much more. I sat frozen in the dim light, listening to his voice steady and quiet on the other end of the line, feeling the story shift again beneath my feet. I did not know what came next, but I knew it was already moving toward us. I barely slept that night. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the garage, the unplugged camera, Lauren's face when she hinted that I had been near the safe room. By the time the sky lightened, gray and cold over Seattle, I was sitting in Tessa's kitchen with my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee I could not bring myself to drink. A little after 8, Daniel buzzed from downstairs. I let him in and watched him walk up the steps with the same steady posture he had the day before, though this morning his eyes carried an added weight. He greeted me calmly but did not waste time on small talk. He sat at the table and folded his hands in front of him. His movements were gentle, deliberate, the way people move when they are preparing someone for a truth that will hurt. He told me that he had spoken with my parents the night before. At first they were defensive, then uneasy, then overwhelmed. They did not want to believe anything he said. They insisted the situation was a misunderstanding. But when he presented the ATM withdrawal, the camera evidence, and Kyle's statement, the denial cracked. My father grew quiet. My mother became visibly shaken. They asked him to stop talking. They said they needed time to think. But Daniel did not let them retreat into half answers. He said he reminded them that accusing someone without evidence could escalate into legal consequences. He said he asked them directly if they still believed I was the one who took the money. My father did not answer. My mother whispered that she did not know what to believe anymore. Then Daniel said something shifted. They began talking too fast. as if trying to outrun the truth closing in on them. They mentioned unpaid taxes, overdue maintenance bills, and a growing stack of financial notices. They admitted they had not told me the full extent of their situation because they were embarrassed. I felt a hollow ache in my chest as Daniel continued. He said that when the pressure rose, my parents revealed that they had been leaning on me financially for far longer than they ever intended. Every time they asked me to help with a bill, they told themselves it would be the last. They had begun to assume I would always fill the gaps, always stay steady, always be available. Then he told me something I already knew but still needed to hear spoken aloud. They had given Lauren the key not because she earned it, but because they hoped responsibility would change her. They hoped it would help her grow. They did not consider what burden it placed on me or what message it sent. I stared down at the table, the surface blurred for a moment. Daniel paused, then told me there was one more part, the hardest part. After he presented the facts, my parents asked him a question that stunned him. They wanted to know if I could simply return the money quietly, without triggering legal trouble for anyone. They asked him to encourage me to admit what they thought was true, even after the evidence began pointing away from me and toward Lauren. A cold disbelief spread through me. Even then, they held to the idea that I might be the safest person to blame. I leaned back and exhaled slowly, feeling a sharp pressure rise in my chest. I asked Daniel how he responded. He said he told them absolutely not. He told them the only path forward was honesty and accountability. He said they needed to understand that protecting Lauren would not save her. It would only harm the person who had already carried the most. I rubbed my forehead and tried to steady myself. He gave me a moment before continuing. He said he also told them that if they continued accusing me, I would be well within my rights to take legal action for defamation, emotional distress, and financial damage. He said he told them he hoped it would not come to that. A long silence stretched between us. Finally, I whispered that I did not know how to process any of this. Not the betrayal, not the denial, not the way they still tried to pull me into their story, even as it unraveled. Daniel said he understood. He said people sometimes cling hardest to the wrong conclusions because admitting the truth means admitting they failed someone they love. He said the evidence was clear. He said Lauren would be held accountable whether my parents liked it or not. He said I needed to stay focused on protecting myself. A soft knock sounded at the door then. Tessa entered with her coat half-zipped and apologized for interrupting. She brought in a grocery bag and began unpacking it. Moving carefully around the tension in the room, when she saw my face she paused, her eyes gentle. She touched my shoulder lightly before stepping into the next room to give us space. Daniel leaned forward again. He said he had one last thing to tell me, and he wanted me to hear it now rather than be blindsided later. While he was gathering information, he reviewed more than just Lauren's credit card. He found several old financial records my parents had kept. Some showed payments I already knew I had made. Others showed payments I had never been told about at all. Bills I had never seen. Emergencies they never mentioned. Withdrawals they must have made in my name because they thought I could handle it. I felt a slow burning rise up my spine. I asked if it was possible someone had used my identity or my account without telling me. Daniel nodded. He said it appeared that way. My breath caught. He assured me that proving it would be straightforward and that any damage could be repaired. But the betrayal was the larger wound. The legal side was fixable. The emotional side was something else entirely. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. I pushed the mug away from me and tried to breathe through the rising tightness in my chest. I felt as if everything I had believed about my place in that family was being pulled apart, thread by thread. After a long moment, I stood and walked toward the window. Snow was still falling, but the flakes were lighter now, drifting gently rather than crashing down. I watched them dissolve against the glass. Behind me, Daniel stood as well. He said he planned to meet with my parents again in a day or two, once they had processed the shock. He said there was a chance they might reach out to me before then, but he advised me not to respond. Not yet. Not until the truth had fully surfaced. I nodded slowly, grateful for his steadiness. He gathered his notes and slipped them into his coat pocket. He told me he would call that evening with an update. Then he left with a quiet nod. When the apartment door clicked shut, the silence deepened. Tessa stepped back into the living room and sat across from me. She did not ask what Daniel had said. She waited until I looked up at her, and when I finally did, She opened her arms and I walked into them without hesitation. The embrace broke something open inside me, not painfully, but with a release I had been holding back for far too long. She told me I was safe here. She told me I was not alone. I let myself believe her. After a while, she pulled back and said she needed to know one thing. Not for legal reasons, not for clarity, but for me. She asked if I wanted my parents back in my life after all of this. I did not answer right away. I stared at my hands, at the faint lines that held years of family history etched into them. I thought of my father's tired eyes, my mother's hopeful denial, Lauren's frightened deceit, Margaret's quiet warnings. I finally whispered that I did not know. It was the only truth I had left to give. The days stretched into evening, snow turned to icy rain, the city lights flickered through the windows, reminding me that life outside the story continued without pause. I tried to settle the storm inside me, but new thoughts kept rising, sharp and insistent. What would my parents say next? What would they admit? What would they deny? And what would Lauren do now that her version of the story was collapsing? Just after 6, my phone buzzed again. I hesitated before picking it up. Daniel's name glowed on the screen. A sudden coldness spread through me as I answered. He took a breath before speaking, and the tone of it told me everything. Something new had happened, something that would change the shape of everything still to come. Daniel's voice was calm, but carried an urgency that sent a ripple through my chest. He said he had just gotten off the phone with my parents again. Something had shifted, something significant. He asked if I was somewhere quiet. I told him I was at Tessa's, and he paused long enough for me to understand that what he was about to say would change everything. He explained that earlier in the evening, my parents confronted Lauren privately. They had spent most of the day reviewing old statements and trying to make sense of the timeline. The pieces finally snapped together when they noticed a small detail in the bank records they had overlooked before. Lauren's credit card company had reached out to them for verification because her account was co-signed years ago when she was a student. A detail they had forgotten entirely. The overdue balance was much larger than they thought. Thousands more. Payments missed. Purchases hidden. And a warning that her account was close to collections. According to Daniel, the moment my parents realized how deep her financial trouble was, everything began to unravel. Lauren broke down completely. She admitted that she had taken the money. She told them she never intended to keep it. She planned to use part of it to make an urgent payment, then replace it before anyone noticed. But when the cash disappeared, she panicked. Instead of admitting what she had done, she let the accusations turn toward me. She said it was easier that way. She said our parents always trusted me to be the strong one, and she assumed I would not fight back. Hearing those words through the phone made my stomach twist. Not because they surprised me, but because they confirmed something I had suspected for years. That Lauren believed I could absorb anything. That she saw my steadiness not as a strength, but as a shield for her own mistakes. Daniel said my parents were devastated. My mother cried harder than he had ever heard anyone cry on the phone. My father could barely speak. The shock of it. The guilt of how they had treated me. The weight of their own denial. All of it hit at once. They told him they wanted to talk to me immediately. They wanted to apologize in person. They wanted to make things right. I stood at the window listening, watching the streaks of rain slide down the glass. A dull ache spread through me. The ache of something long hoped for, and yet too late to feel comforting. Daniel told me he would support whatever decision I made. If I wanted legal recourse, he would pursue it. If I wanted mediation, he would arrange it. If I wanted distance, he would help me set boundaries. There was no pressure, no expectation, only choice. I thanked him quietly. My voice felt thin but steady. We agreed to meet later in the week to finalize the formal agreement for repayment. When I hung up the phone, the apartment fell silent again. Tessa stepped into the room. She had heard enough from my side of the call to understand the shape of things. She sat beside me and waited. I told her everything. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she let out a slow breath and shook her head. She said she was angry for me, sad for me, relieved for me. All at once, I felt the same. Every emotion tangled together with no clear path out. Hours passed before I received the message I knew would come. It was from my father. He asked if they could see me the next day. He wrote that they owed me more than an apology. He wrote that their eyes were finally open. My mother followed with a shorter message. She asked for forgiveness, but said she understood if I needed time. I stared at the messages until the screen dimmed. I did not reply immediately, not out of anger, but because I needed to feel something other than the exhaustion that had settled in my bones. The next morning was clear and cold when I drove down to Tacoma. The storm had passed, and the world looked scrubbed clean. I arrived at my parents' house around 10. I sat in the driveway for several minutes before stepping out. The house looked the same, but I no longer felt like a part of it. Inside, my parents stood in the living room waiting for me. My mother's eyes were red. My father looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. Lauren sat on the couch, hands folded tightly in her lap, her face pale. She stood the moment she saw me. Her voice cracked as she said she was sorry. Truly sorry. She admitted everything again, this time with no softening, no excuses. She said she had been drowning financially and terrified of disappointing our parents. She said she thought handing the blame to me would buy her time. She said she never imagined it would go this far. I listened quietly. My chest felt heavy, but not in the collapsing way it used to, more like the weight of something I was finally putting down. My mother stepped forward next. She said she had failed me. She said she had convinced herself I did not need the same care or attention as Lauren because I never asked for it. She said she thought strength meant independence. She said she was wrong. My father's apology came last. Or maybe it was not an apology. Maybe it was confession. He told me he had leaned on me for too long. He told me he let responsibility blur into expectation. He told me he had not realized how invisible I had become in the space they built around Lauren. I let their words settle, slowly, carefully, like someone stepping into cold water inch by inch. Then I told them the truth I had carried my entire life. I told them that I had loved this family with everything I had, that I spent years trying to be the steady one, the reliable one, the unshakable one. But being strong did not mean I did not feel pain. It did not mean I did not need to be seen. I told them I needed boundaries, real ones. I told them I would not be stepping back into the old roles. I would not carry their bills. I would not be the safety net. I would rebuild a relationship only if they learned to stand on their own feet and see me as a person, not a solution. My mother nodded through tears. My father bowed his head. Lauren whispered that she understood. There were no dramatic hugs, no sudden healing, just a quiet recognition that things would be different now, that they had to be. Daniel arrived shortly after to finalize the agreement. Lauren would repay the full amount within 12 months. My parents would provide written statements clearing my name if anything official had been filed or implied. And all future financial matters would be managed without involving me unless I chose to be part of them. When everything was signed and settled, I stepped outside. The sun was bright on the cold pavement. I felt lighter somehow, not because the hurt was gone, but because I had finally set it down. On the drive back to Seattle, I let the quiet fill me. The road stretched ahead, long and open, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like it belonged to me. Thank you for staying with me until the end of the story. I would love to know where you are watching from and which moment stayed with you the most. Your thoughts help these stories travel farther and find the people who need them.